Welcome to this channel. Today is Sunday, the 16th of June 2024. The theme of this video is saturated fat, a proven devil. We might have been educated by scientists and experts since the 1950s that saturated fat is bad for health, basing on observational studies showing that people who consumed high amounts of saturated fat experienced higher rates of death from heart disease. In addition, the diet heart hypothesis states that saturated fat raises the low-density lipoproteins, LDL, bad cholesterol, in the blood, supposedly causing heart disease. While this remains unproven, the World Health Organization nevertheless recommends limiting the intake of saturated fat. In fact, recent studies have turned up to mixed results on the connection between saturated fat consumption and heart disease. Before we approach those studies, let's first get ourselves acquainted with what saturated fat is and how it may impact on our health. What is saturated fat? Saturated and unsaturated fats are the two main classes of fat, with the former generally solid at room temperature and the latter in liquid form. The main dietary sources of saturated fat are fatty meat, tallow, lard, butter, cheese, cream, palm oil, coconut oil, and cocoa butter. All fats are composed of molecules called fatty acids, which are chains of carbon atoms. The length of the carbon chains will determine the types of saturated fatty acid. May we then turn to the 5 studies before we may conclude how saturated fat may affect our health? The first is Stuart M. study of dietary fatty acids, macronutrient substitutions, food sources, and incidence of coronary heart disease. Findings from the EPIC CVD case cohort study across 9 European countries, published by Journal of the American Heart Association, 2021. With data from 16,073 people in 9 countries in Europe, the study revealed that the total saturated fat intake had no connection with a higher risk of heart disease. However, specific foods high in saturated fat had different effects on the risk of heart disease. Because of this, researchers point out that it is important to consider a larger picture for the overall composition of foods rather than focusing only on the individual nutrients they contain. The second is Truer case study of biomarkers of dairy fat intake, incident cardiovascular disease, and all-cause mortality, a cohort study, systematic review, and meta-analysis published by PLOS Medicine, 2021. The studies included more than 40,000 participants and measured the blood levels of pentadecanoic acid and heptadecanoic acid, both of which are saturated fats found in dairy. The results of the studies revealed that higher blood levels of pentadecanoic acid and heptadecanoic acid were connected to a lower risk to heart disease, but not deaths. Blood levels of trans-palmitoleic acid were not associated with the risk of heart disease or death at all. Therefore, consuming higher amounts of saturated fat from dairy may be associated with a reduced risk of heart disease. The third is the study of reduction in saturated fat intake for cardiovascular disease, published by Cochrane Database Systematic Review, 2020. With 15 randomized controlled trials with 56,675 participants, the study showed that reducing total saturated fat intake could decrease the risk of cardiovascular events by approximately 17%, but had no effect on the risk of dying from heart disease or other causes. More specifically, replacing some saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat in the diet resulted in a 21% lower risk of cardiovascular events, while replacing saturated fat with carbohydrates was linked to a 16% lower risk. The result of the study revealed that reducing saturated fat intake or increasing consumption of saturated fat had the same mortality rate of heart disease and other causes. The fourth is Gribbins as study of association of carbohydrate and saturated fat intake with cardiovascular disease and mortality in Australian women, published by Hart, 2021. The study included 9,899 women ages 50 to 55, whom the researchers followed for 15 years. The result of the study revealed that increased saturated fat intake was not associated with a higher risk of heart disease or death, and was linked to lower rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and high blood pressure. The fifth and final is Garnizet's Tarrant lipid and glucose study of the association between dietary fats and the incidence risk of cardiovascular outcomes, published by Nutrition and Metabolism, 2021. The study involved 2,809 adults over an average of 10.6 years, estimating dietary fat intake by use of a food frequency questionnaire. The study found no connection between total intake of saturated fat or the consumption of specific saturated fatty acids like palmitic acid, lauric acid, stearic acid, and myristic acid, and the risk of heart disease. That is, saturated fat intake had no connection with a higher risk of heart disease. What these findings revealed are that, first, reducing saturated fat intake has no effect on your risk of heart disease or death. Second, there are mixed results for reduction of your risk of cardiovascular events by replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat. Third and final, different food sources of saturated fat may have different impact on the risk of heart disease. So, instead of just being told or educated about how saturated fat may cause harm to our health, and by following suit, the impact to our health because of the avoidance of consuming saturated fat may have been costly. However, damage is done. But now the carrier is turning its navigated course. Most scientists now accept that saturated fats are not as unhealthy as previously assumed. Evidence also suggests that they don't cause heart disease, though their exact role is still being debated and investigated. Now, is it time for us to re-embrace this long-time misunderstood old friend, saturated fat? Thank you for watching and listening. Goodbye.